Hi there. I'm Cindy Linden, and this is a Cookalong podcast quick bite. If you listen regularly to the Cookalong podcast, you will have heard a ton of interesting tips that I throw in as I'm cooking, stuff I've learned over the years of cooking that I'm not even thinking about, that just show up when I'm doing a recipe. I thought it would be fun to do this quick bite podcast about some things that I've told you before in many podcasts, just because I really want them locked in your head so that you do it every time without thinking and without question. And some that I never get around to sharing that I really think are cool tips. I just thought I'd just sort of randomly scatter them in front of you for you to choose from. We're going to start, of course, with measuring flour. I will say this every single time. I have said this every single time that we have cooked a recipe together in which you are baking something with flour. Anything with flour, because it really does make a huge difference. So I'm going to say it here again, just for the record. Always, when you're baking anything, stir up your flour, fluff it up, just gently stir it before you measure anything out. Because otherwise you're getting way too much flour. It's packed, it's dense, gravity's been working on it for who knows how long. You need to fluff it up just gently so that it's aerated, that's the official term, before you scoop it into a cup. And that's the second part. Don't scoop your cup into the flour, scoop your flour into the cup. Using a spoon, take that newly fluffed flour and spoon it into your measuring cup. Otherwise, again, you will have way too much flour. What's the big deal about that? Some people might ask, if they don't listen to the Cookalong podcast regularly. The big deal is that it will make your baked goods drier and tougher and less flaky and less fluffy, and they just won't be as good as you want them to be. So this is a simple way to make your baked stuff better. Come out right, the way you want them. Right? Just do that with the flour. Moving on. Sorry to belabor that, but I really believe it strongly, obviously. So now let's talk about baking soda. I've told you you can use it to clean pans with, and I highly recommend that you do that. But here's some cooking things with it. If you're browning some ground beef or some ground turkey or some ground chicken, if you add just a pinch, and I really do mean just a tiny pinch, it takes 1/8 of a teaspoon. You just sprinkle that in while you're browning your meat, and it will make the meat brown better. Instead of boiling in its own juice and its own moisture, the moisture gets sealed inside the little bits of ground beef, and the outsides of the ground beef are actually against the pan and not against the juice or the liquid, and they actually brown. This is an amazing trick. You won't believe me until you try it. It's remarkable. You will be so shocked at how quickly it browns when you're used to it just sitting there turning gray. Okay? Just sprinkle in a tiny pinch of baking soda next time you're going to brown some meat and watch what happens. It's very cool. It also can help your onions caramelize way faster. Just a tiny pinch of baking soda. You know, caramelizing onions takes a long time. If you really want them caramelized, you're going to stand around watching them cook on very low heat for a really long time, getting brown and wilty and sweet. If you add a pinch of baking soda, it makes that process so much faster. Those are my hot tips about baking soda. Now let's go back to meat for a minute. You may have read this, you may have heard this. If you haven't, it's important. If you're trying to brown a piece of meat, whether that's a chicken breast or a pork chop or a steak, the meat needs to be dry. You have to pat it dry with a paper towel or something before you cook it. Otherwise, what's hitting the pan is essentially liquid and not the meat, because there's a liquid coating on the outside of most meat when you take it out of the package. You need to dry that off before you try to brown it, or again, you may get more gray than real brown. And when you take the moisture off the surface of the meat is going to instantly stick to your pan. Here's the second trick, which is don't turn it over and don't take it off the heat until it releases on its own. It's going to be stuck there. You're going to pry your little spatula underneath there and think, oh no, I've stuck this to the bottom of the pan and I've ruined it. Just wait. Eventually, you will stick your little spatula underneath there and it will pick up really easily. It'll just scoop right off. Why? Because it's crusty now and it wants you to turn it. Up until then, it did not want you to turn it. So that's the trick. Dry off the meat, put it in the pan, don't move it until it lets you do it easily. It's communicating something important to you. Okay? Let's see. What else? I have in my freezer ice cubes made of lime juice. I have some of lemon juice, and I have some of buttermilk. That means that I squeezed a bunch of those fruits, or I had buttermilk that was about to go bad that I didn't know how I was going to use it. Or half and half, since sometimes you might buy a little carton of half and half to use in a recipe and then you don't know what to do with the rest of it, but some other recipe day you'll need it. And I poured those things into individual ice cube trays and froze them, and then popped them out of the trays and put them in plastic bags that I labeled carefully so I knew what they were. And I have them in my freezer for me to use whenever I have a recipe that says that it needs fresh lemon juice, or a drink perhaps like a margarita that needs fresh lime juice, or a sauce or a batter or a creme fraiche or anything that needs buttermilk. It's in your freezer. If it needs to be liquid, you defrost it. In a creme fraiche, you don't even have to do that. You just throw it in there, although that will make it take a little bit longer because you're starting with something frozen. I also do that with pesto, either leftover or just intentionally. I freeze it in ice cube trays, and then I have these little bricks of pesto that I can use randomly throughout the year. An ice cube is about 2 tablespoons of whatever you've put in it. Very handy to have. They'll keep indefinitely. It's just a suggestion from me to you that it might be handy to have those things in your freezer, and it might be worth actually making a plan to get those things into your freezer. Speaking of fruits that you're going to juice, if you're going to juice a lime, a lemon, or an orange, it will juice better if you cut off the bumpy part of the end. The lemons and limes in particular, they have one end that's usually got a bump on it. When you try to juice that, it's going to get in the way and the juicer won't be able to effectively do its job. But if you cut that flat before you start, then no matter what kind of juicer you're using, you will get more of the juice out. So just trim off that bumpy spot before you do it. Speaking again of lemons, if you roast, okay, this is going to sound weird, but if you roast lemons before you make lemonade out of them, this is assuming that you like making fresh lemonade, you roast them first before you squeeze them, and it will make the lemons sweeter and less tart. So you cut them in half and you roast them at 400 for 20 to 30 minutes. That's a preheated oven until they're brown and just kind of starting to look a little charred. And then you cool them and you make your lemonade as usual, but don't put in as much sweetener as you usually do. If it's simple syrup, just put in like half and then taste it, because you've released enough sugar in the lemon that you may not need as much sweetener in it. And then you can always add more later, but if you get it too sweet, you can't undo that, right? And by the way, maple syrup, if you don't want to bother with making simple syrup and you have maple syrup, the real kind, real maple syrup in the house, just replace your simple syrup with maple syrup. I learned that from my whiskey sour recipe, actually, which you can find on my website, thecookalongpodcast.com, that replacing simple syrup with maple syrup is simple. It's always in my house, in my refrigerator. The real stuff you have to keep refrigerated. And it adds this kind of interesting dimension to your drinks without being really obvious about what it is. I mean, it doesn't taste like maple. It just tastes sweet, but it adds this kind of extra richness. So you could consider doing that instead of simple syrup at all. Let's see, what else? Homemade chili or even canned chili, actually any kind of chili, needs a little vinegar. You could also use lime juice, but I happen to like the vinegar better. The acidity just really does some magic to any kind of chili. It just brightens it. You don't want a lot. It's just a little drip or two, a few little drizzles into your chili just as you're serving it, that it can be stirred in. It really does wonders for your chili. You can use apple cider vinegar, white vinegar. I sometimes use seasoned rice vinegar, which also has a little sugar in it. Or like I said, squeeze a wedge of lime over it. The acid is great. It makes the chili just pop. Okay, I don't know how else to say it. If you're roasting vegetables, it's so easy. You just cut up your vegetables into bite-sized pieces and toss them with oil and a little salt. Throw them on a baking sheet and roast them at 425 for 20 to 30 minutes. Here's a tip to make them even better. While you're preheating your oven, you put the sheet pan that you're going to use for roasting in the oven to preheat along with the oven. Why would you do that? 2 reasons. It then cooks your vegetables faster, and it browns them better. In terms of saving time, I got another couple of tips. If you're going to saute some mushrooms, microwave them first. Not very long, just enough to soften them up a little bit. There's some excess water in mushrooms that if you microwave them first before you saute them, the excess water goes away. So they saute a lot faster because that moisture isn't boiling out of there. And ditto with potatoes. If you're going to fry them or if you're going to roast them, sometimes potatoes will be the last thing to get done, right? You probably know this, especially if you roast vegetables all mixed up together. It's the potatoes you're really waiting for, right? Well, microwave them first. Just microwave them until they just start to give a little bit, all right? You really don't want to cook them. You just want to give them a little head start so that by the time they are frying or roasting, they are more likely to get cooked through more quickly. Random tip, any kind of sauce, and believe it or not, even tomato sauce, if you add a bit of cold butter to any sauce right at the end, it adds some richness and some shine that will make your sauce just a little bit better. Kind of takes it over the top edge to make sure it's really the best it can be. A good rule for almost anything you're cooking, unless the recipe specifies when to add the garlic. Add the garlic last so it won't burn and it will keep its flavor. The longer you cook it, the more the flavor kind of disseminates into the sauce. If you want a soft garlic flavor, put it in earlier. If you want a brighter garlic flavor, put it in later. If you want an intense garlic flavor, put it in at the very end. And final rule for this podcast, when in doubt, double the garlic. You can't go wrong. There's no such thing as too much garlic. Okay? Trust me. Those are the tips I've thought of for today. Maybe I'll do this again when some more come to me. I hope you use these. They're great ideas. If I do say so myself, please go forth and use my tips. There will be another Quick Bite podcast 2 weeks from today, every other Saturday. And the in-between Saturdays are brand new recipes. And until next time, happy cooking!